Good morning, Mobile, and all of our friends along the Gulf Coast. We are so glad you've joined us again for another episode of the Echo Stop Live podcast. Here with my good friend Curtis. Curtis,
good morning. How are you?
I got a surprise for you.
Another surprise? Yeah.
You got a surprise.
A surprise I can see, right?
A surprise you can see. I am joined by not only somebody that maybe you are familiar with, but also a friend, somebody that's been a friend of us and really what we're fighting for in our community for a long time. So, Eric Reynolds, welcome very much to our show.
Eric. My pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction, too. I appreciate that. And definitely very extremely supportive of what you all are doing. It's so important. In fact, there's something you all always talk about, how important it is to have the community with you to break the change.
Well, you've been with us from day one. We appreciate it.
And, I just kind of like to break the ice for just a second, although it's starting to warm up here. Obviously, you may be known for newscasts and reporting things, and it's probably all too often that you report stories of violence. Tell us about that sort of thing, the perspective of having to sort of see these things happen as they unfold.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of twofold because I've had the experience of course, just reporting the violence and it be near somewhere that either I live or frequent, like I was just sharing with you all that I just left Nashville Sunday evening, and just the ironic aspect of that. A few months ago, the Walmart in Chesapeake, Virginia, is where I go and shop when we go home to Virginia to visit the mothers. They had the mass violence there, the mass shooting of the employees shooting other employees. And so, those things ring a bell to you. But then when you are reporting the news, I never see the video or the pictures before I'm live on the air. I see them when you see them. Mm-hmm. And so as I look up and I see somebody I know, and that's when the other aspect of it hits home, that this is something that is a problem and that we need to fix. And my commitment is to do what I can to support those who are also doing something to see how we can end this senseless violence.
I've said to you before how hard it must be for you being that person that early morning you're having to share some of the worst news imaginable, not just from the perspective of sitting there at the desk, but as a citizen of the same community, because it impacts you just as much as it does us.
It does indeed. It's something that my wife and myself and our family, we care about.
Right.
We live in this city. We've been here I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else in my life, and I've lived in a few places along the way, And so this is indeed where we have made a stake as far as a community that we care about, concerned about, and it is very difficult to have that be a focus, and I'm sitting there for 4.5 hours, and some of these things I'll say more than twice over the 4.5 hours, and so it is indeed difficult, extremely disappointing, and motivating, though, to say, what can we do? What can I do as a citizen of the community to make a difference?
Well, let's talk about that for just a second, because we were joking earlier before we started, but we get to ask the questions today. So
reversal of roles here. Okay.
Well, we are so blessed to have you here because you're a wealth of experience, knowledge. But if I'm being totally honest, which is how I like to live my life. You're totally filled with the spirit that our community needs, and I feel like that's something we should talk about too. And so, what motivates you to, it's one thing to do your job, and you do your job extremely well, but behind the scenes, outside, I don't know if that's behind the scenes or in front of the scenes, but not on the scenes, how do you one, stay encouraged, and two, what motivates you to continue to keep doing this, to share the information so that the community knows what's going on?
Great question.
Well, the decision for me was made years ago when I saw the power of television. We had issues in our nation over the years as it relates to civil rights and equal opportunity and diversity. And I grew up in the Deep South, a little place called Albany, Georgia, and then Atlanta. Those are my two homes because of going back and forth and being with grandparents and that type of thing, and seeing things. But it's funny. I lost my dad a couple of years ago, and I was talking to him in the last few years of his life and just sharing different things. And I was telling him, I remember succinctly being a preteen in 1969, and the hope and optimism that I was feeling and sensing and I guess wanting of the 1970s, what that was going to bring. And I guess I'm dating myself to some of our younger officers who are in here with us. But there was a hope and an optimism as a child I had going into that period. And I came from a background of why I am like I am. My great-grandfather was a Baptist pastor and leader. My grandfather was also one of his sons was a Baptist minister and leader, arrested with Dr. King back in the Albany movement, and also part of making that place a better place. And then 4 of his brothers were also pastors. And so I think that was sort of one of those things where you wanted to live up to what you were a part of and coming out of. And so, I don't want to talk so much about myself, but you look back and you see that my great-grandfather was born in 1867. So he was first removed from slavery, and he set a course for our family to where the 14 children that he and my great-grandmother had. I never met her because I think she was tired. And my great-grandfather, he lived to be 95. And so to see what his generation of children accomplished, it left a legacy for all of us wanting to make a difference, involved in the NAACP and other community things. And so I saw this as a way to make a difference, to use the media to tell the truth, as you said earlier, and to expose all the information, to lay it out there so all good people could come to the table and see what we could do.
What I hear from that, Eric, is faith, hope, and action. Okay, when you said that you were in 1969 thinking about 1970 and what that would bring, that's the hope for better.
Yes.
Okay, but not just hope, bring about action or work that will help you actually see that come to fruition. And I think we're dealing with the same issues today. We're still trying to find the hope that allows us to move forward. But without the action to support that hope, we don't move forward.
And I'm hearing something else too. I heard everything you just described, and I heard something else that's super important. And you even said it yourself. You said, "Well, it's not about me. It's not." But I have a story.
I know you do.
You have a story.
Absolutely.
Our stories shape how we grow into our purpose, into our mission. Sometimes in all communities, regardless of how they get their mail and what the zip code is on the envelope, we get separated from what our mission is and what our story is, right? And I feel like having these conversations, although some of it may seem reminiscent to you and you're kind of going back, but it's who shaped who you are. Right. And that shows to me how important it is that that story be shaped properly, because later on in life, that's from what we have developed.
So true.
And this goes back to conversations we've had many, many times about the different pillars in our community. And I'm not necessarily talking to people, but when you talk about faith, family, education, and the government, when those pillars wash away or they're diluted or they don't exist, there's a fundamental piece missing out of that story. And we have to compensate somehow. We have to cope. We have to find a way to manage. And people are really good at managing. But it doesn't always work out with the best interest. And, we want to just take the person for where they're at and say, oh, aha, this person's here. And we never really take the time to get to the story to figure out how they got there. And every person has a story. You've talked to a lot of people in your career, I'm sure. And so, how is your story told? If we were telling your story from where you grew up to where you are now, How is your story told? If you had to describe it in just a couple sentences, what your mission is to make a difference in our community. How's that story told?
That's a good question there. I know that I was shaped by family, because I was blessed to have 2 sets of grandparents, 2 great-grandfathers, and 3 great-grandmothers. And my time growing up in Albany, Georgia, I was blessed to have interaction, involvement with them, learning, observing, and the expectation of what they told me that I should be about. And so you definitely had that. And then my parents, they worked very hard, and they were that first generation of opportunity. First in many categories that they were in, and they both were high achievers in what they accomplished. And so, of course, as a child, you are emulating your parents, and you want to be like they are, and to be good folk. And my dad was involved in the civil rights movement. So as a young man, I saw him. I was in elementary school, and he was a part of Dr. King's funeral there in Atlanta, and kept me out of school that day so I could go to the funeral on the Morehouse campus in the lawn. So, showing you the things that were important, the things that he and my mother were doing, accomplishing, and wanting to be a part of continuing the legacy, I guess you could say. And so when I caught hold of television broadcasting and news, I didn't give it up until I got in it. And I was extremely blessed because at the time I got into the industry, not a lot of people that looked like me were on camera. They were behind the camera. And I became good and efficient behind the camera. And not for a blessing, while I was in the U.S. Air Force, one of my officers, we were visiting the TV stations because we were doing we did. When I came back from overseas, we did capsules on the TV station and radio stations. And he made a statement to the news director at the station we were visiting that you need to get rid of the guy on the weekend and hire this guy. And these are 2 white guys talking in 1981 in South Florida, Panama City, Florida. So, but he spoke out for me, and I got an audition. The other guy, unfortunately, was fired, and I was hired, an opportunity to be in front of the camera. And so once I got that, I made sure that that was going to be the way that I had an opportunity to do. But to say this further, that at that time, an Air Force captain, he and I are still friends this day. And he named one of his sons after me.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
You know something, Eric, you've been a staple in the homes of so many Mobilians and our neighbors in Pensacola, Fort Walton for so long. And hearing you today speak about what helped shape your life has to be impactful to someone listening today, for someone who does not have the family dynamics that you had, that want to know what that looks like, so that they may emulate that in their own family moving forward, so that they can turn the needle or move the needle and see their families actually thrive moving forward.
And I think another important thing is, we're talking about opportunities. One thing I do want to mention to our viewers, again, thank you for tuning in, is we have several ways for you as the viewer to interact. This is not just us talking to you. We want to talk with you. And so the very first thing I would say is that if you have a question, or if you want to shoot us an email at echostoplive@gmail.com, that's echostoplive@gmail.com. We try to get to at least one question every episode, and if not, we'll certainly answer every question we receive. But also, if you know of something that's going on and you want to report something anonymously, we have an anonymous tip line that we launched several months ago. It's extremely successful. And the reason it's successful is not because of what we're doing when we receive the tips, but because citizens in our community care enough about the community to take the time to send us something. And you can call us on the phone. That's 844-251-0644, 844-251-0644. That's our anonymous tip line. Send us some information. You've heard people say something. Say something. We say see something, say something, and do something. And this is one of the things you can do. And along those lines, when you're talking about opportunities, let's fast forward just a little bit. We're sitting here. This is a rare thing where you have law enforcement hosting a podcast from within law enforcement. But we really just see ourselves as who we are, which is members of all the communities that surround this area, trying to make this the best place we can. And so we have an opportunity. And how do you see the opportunities improving with law enforcement and media in that relationship? How do they have to work together? How do we continue to keep trust and also help further the safety of our community through the power of media?
Well, it's incumbent that we work together, that we find a way to work through any difficulties or situations that happen. We had one that happened a few weeks ago with people making decisions on the media end that they were asked not to, and it created some difficulties, and so I think it's incumbent upon both. So transparency, I guess, is one of the keys. It's got to be a situation where both sides feel that each is being upfront and sharing, what the deal is, and this is our reality and this is ours. And I think on the media side, we have to be beyond trying to just focus on being the first to break a news story, but how do we see the big picture, working together to change some things that we want to see change in this community. I have to bring this up to you, and you talked about it briefly, see something, say something. If a person wants to see how important it is to have a relationship and not be about just being quiet and not sharing information, the old episodes of In the Heat of the Night. I don't know if you all remember that, but many times they would go to the bottoms and people would pretend like nothing happened. They didn't see nothing. People were laying in the street dead, and nobody could tell you anything. But at the same time, they had a changing of the law enforcement staff to where they had black males and females, and they had women also coming forward for the first time and trying to represent the community. But yet they were still not getting the cooperation they needed when things would happen, and they had a few people who would, and sometimes one guy who was always available if there was some money involved to give the information. So it's important that people feel the freedom to share, and they have to see the benefit of what it will mean to their community if they rid themselves of some of the things. That's why they want you all out there. But they have to understand it's a job that we all have to take on. So,
and there's a balance to be struck with it, of course. I know for the media, I would imagine that, although that it's best to work with law enforcement to put out correct information.
Exactly.
Okay? Because it's hard to go back and correct something.
It is.
So that's important, but it's just as important.
Damaging to the people you're reporting on. You can give information that's not factual, and it's a mistake, and they never get the same vehicle to drive the truth or the corrections.
But you also want to make sure that the public sees you as a unbiased organization, and that your relationship with law enforcement is all fact finding and bringing to minds what's actually true and what needs to be said about the moment at that particular time.
And I think this goes to the core of the mission of Operation Echo Stop itself, which is what drove us into this podcast. We say, don't just impede violence, but improve perception. Right. What we found is violence is an issue we're tackling, and we're making a lot of headway. But again, if you feel unsafe when you go to sleep at night, then the crime stats don't help you as much as the environment. And so we have to tackle every person's story and look at every one of those stories and figure it out. And speaking of stories, we're going to take just a few minutes here to check out a pretty cool little video that we've had put together for the show.
There are so many things that we can see and experience right here, our Mobile Delta. This is one of the most incredible waterways in the world. The Native Americans knew, the first settlers. This is what they saw. Love being at Five Rivers, getting a chance to sort of go back in time. This is that little place where you can experience the peace and tranquility of days gone by.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Good Day Gulf Coast. I'm Eric Reynolds.
Well, that was awesome, and I'm still here, so they didn't fire me, which is a pretty good thing. But I have a question. I have lots of questions, actually.
You do.
But he said, and he's a trained subject matter expert, that my last question was really good.
Okay.
So I get to ask another one. But no, I mean, even when you have to face a camera and report not just a news story, but you're literally chronicling the chapter in somebody's life, because that incident has affected somebody.
Right. It changed a life forever.
Well, it has. First question is, can you recall a time where the news wasn't reporting these types of stories as much? I mean, are we, how do you see that change? Is there a paradigm shift in the reporting of violence, or do you feel that that's driving news industry, or?
Well, that's been one of the questions that we've had to debate among ourselves as it relates to the news industry. How much do we report from that criminal side versus other things that are happening in the community? And so that's that balance that we have to figure out and work as well. As I think back over the years, I have didn't report as much depending on where I was. There wasn't as much in one market that I worked in, but then in the other market I worked in, which was larger than this one, we had 7 cities, and one of the cities had problems more than the norm. And so, and one of my problems that I have, and I will say this as it relates to, we have to find a balance, and then we have to be fair to our outlying areas. It's not fair for us to go to these places only when there's something tragic or unbelievably in the criminal level of activity has happened, but yet we don't go when they're having something good, the good stories.
Right.
And so it's something that I have been talking about for years, and unfortunately, it's a manpower issue sometimes. It's an issue of distance, and something else happens.
When you're talking about you're talking about the story of living versus the story of killing, the story of tragedy. So let's talk about that for just a second. If part of our mission in the community, part of what we have the power to do, whether it's through your work, through our podcast, through just us being on the street, is to change that perception, not because we just want somebody to think different, but we want them to feel safe. And that's a decision they get to make based on what they see happening around them, right? So if we want that story to be about living and not to be about killing, not to be about death, not to be about robbery, not to be about those things, and we have to tackle those issues. I mean, law enforcement clearly has to tackle those issues, but society,
you can't do it by yourself.
100% right. So society has to come in and assist with all of these other fundamentals. Where do you see yourself? Not the news reporter.
But as an individual?
Where do you see yourself as Eric Reynolds in that?
Well, as an individual, I have to get myself involved in either an organization or things that my church may be doing, other opportunities when I hear about groups that may be doing something that I can help them facilitate what the mission is, because it's important that me as a just Joe citizen do my part. I try and do it within the framework of what I do for a living every day, as well as when I'm not wearing that hat and I'm not in that facility working or representing them out in the street, because it's something I care about, because I live here too. In the course of my time here, people that I know have been affected by the crime, the violence. We've lost people to death due to those things. And so, I care about that just like I would if it was happening to my immediate family.
Here's the question. So we do have a question that came in. So thank you for sending in this question, Mary from Mobile. It seems like every day in our country, the news shows another killing. What must people do to make this stop? That's a great question. And I like the way that you asked that question. What must people do to make that stop? Because it doesn't happen on its own. So, you're in the hot seat. You get the answer.
Well, as I was alluding to earlier, it's an issue that we grapple with every day, and unfortunately, the human nature of people, just like how you all have to have tape up and officers getting people back, people want to know. They heard the sirens, they heard the shots, they know the fire truck went down that way, they see the black smoke, they see you all taking people away. People want to know, they're curious, and unfortunately they, in many cases, want to know more about that kind of story than they do the good story. There have been experiments in media where they tried to do good newscasts. And I think Ted Turner was the last one to do it. And it only goes so far, you know. You can either do something where it's funny stories about people getting hurt and having accidents, you know. You've seen those kind of shows. And then what we do. And so there is a fine balance, though, because it turns me off if I'm watching somebody else's newscast and every story in the first, we call the first block of the newscast, is something bad. So it's up to people, it's up to us to be better, and of course, all of us helping you all do your job even more effective.
You don't have to respond to this, but I'll tell you.
He's in the seat where we respond.
I will tell you this. Far too often I've heard a saying, and that saying is,
I know what you're going to say.
If it does not bleed, it does not lead. Eric, you don't answer that, okay? You don't have to.
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't always get to make that decision as the news anchor because we have a team, including producers, who in a lot of cases, they make those decisions, and then we have to argue about them. And unfortunately, we don't always have that time in the mornings to argue with anybody because there's a time crunch, you know.
Right.
So that is something, I mean, people say it in the newsroom, and especially younger people who are just getting into the business. And that's one of the things that is another issue as you have newer generations of people who think differently, who grew up differently than we did, and who didn't see some of those foundational institutions that we saw and respected in a way to where the respect may not be the same today. Some values study just came out from the Washington Post talking about the values that people have today are not as succinct as they were 10, 20 years ago.
And, you know, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that's social media and just technology today that we didn't have back in the 70s, for example, or even the 80s.
Right.
But how much does technology play in reporting stories and getting it right the first time, as opposed to getting it out because it's already out, but you're trying to get ahead of it as best you can to make sure that you're in the know of what's going on?
Well, we monitor social media, but it's not our driving force to where if something is on those different platforms, okay, well, we've got to have it on the newscast. It doesn't work like that in our operation. But if we see something that looks like a possible story, and because people who are in the midst will report it to their audience, whereas you all are still trying to gather facts, and then we're trying to ask you what are the facts, you know, and so you've got that going on, but we don't roll with something that's on social media and go with what their facts are. And because we consider you all the official people who are on scene, who are doing the research, who are doing the investigating.
And we appreciate what you guys do as well as all the other stations. I think what's so important for us is that getting it right the first time plays a big part in making sure that the community works with law enforcement and law enforcement works with the community to bridge that gap and not to create any further gaps.
And I think you hit on something super important. And I'm just going to use this time as we wind up our show. We've got about a minute left, and I feel like this podcast sort of joining forces, at least for 30 minutes this morning, with somebody with a wealth of knowledge about mass media and the media communications and the news industry, which is essentially where the front lines meets the headlines. That we remind you that this podcast is on Facebook. It's on YouTube. We have a number, 844-251-0644. You can call that number, 844-251-0644, and you can report anonymous tips, and you can even email us. We read questions every episode, or at least try to, and we'll get to all the questions at echostopplive@gmail.com. we want to come alongside you. We want you to come alongside us. This is a rally cry. If we want to change our community, if we want to make our community the safe place we know it can be, then that effort has to start here, has to start with us. And we just want to serve as sort of a reminder every Friday at 8:30, why do we come on the show? To have a real conversation. Look, if we've done something that we're not supposed to do, we want to talk about it. If something in society has happened that's not supposed to happen, we want to talk about it. And we're in this tug of war right now. And so any last minute comments,
definitely.
A word of life.
Yeah, I want to wrap that part up because it is our commitment, our mission to deliver the truth, the facts.
Right.
And let me say, a lot of stuff has changed in mass media today, unfortunately, and some people that are doing dastardly things. Mm-hmm. But in the news shop that I work in, that is our commitment. Yeah. And it pains us when we read a story one day and then the next morning the facts have changed. So it bothers us too. And unfortunately, that part, I don't know how to correct when you're working with other people and different parts of the day. And then one of the sad things for us is that in the early mornings, we can't call you guys to say, Commander Graves, let me check on this, because we're talking about 3 o'clock in the morning. So, being realistic and even reaching some of our people that time of the morning to verify things. But I will tell you that Sarah Wall and I, my co-anchor, it drives us crazy when we end up reporting something the second day and realize that what we reported the first day wasn't correct.
Yeah.
And I think as the community learns to trust in the source and know that sometimes the information that feeds the source is different, but the source is not the problem. And I think there's that trust in that. And we certainly respect you. You come to us with a wealth of respect. Certainly carved out 30 minutes this morning to sit with us. And so we're very fortunate and thankful.
This is my pleasure.
Well, it's an honor for us, and we certainly would love to have you come back. We could talk for hours, I know. And I just want to remind our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Our mission, honestly, is super simple. We want to impede violence, and we want to improve perception. Curtis and I have conversations all throughout the day, every day, and on the weekends. We're constantly talking about different ways we can do things, and so we appreciate you tagging along and tuning in just for this short episode with us. We hope to see you next Friday at 8:30 on our EquiStop Live podcast. Mr. Reynolds, thank you again for joining us.
Having me.
Thank you for what you do, and we'll see you all soon. Stay safe.
Have a great Friday.